speaking. Welcome everybody to this evening's webinar hosted by the Progressive Economy Forum entitled Green Growth, Degrowth and the Just Transition. It's one of a series of webinars we've been putting on over the last sort of few months or so on issues that we think are of interest to the sort of wider economic justice movement. We've covered UBI and job guarantees. We've covered the impact of Brexit, all sorts of things with a series of excellent, I hope, panel discussions with expert speakers. And I think we're very lucky this evening to have a similar setup with a really brilliant panel of speakers, of people who can get into some of the key issues here around something that I think is becoming increasingly pressing, really for all of us, but perhaps especially for those who have been environmental campaigners for some time or have spent some time campaigning on climate change, which is that although we're now in a situation where, bar a few holdouts, at least in Britain, there aren't that many people who deny that climate change is happening. We are instead starting to see a series of arguments around how expensive it would be to do anything about this, occurring at the same time as I think a kind of slightly fatalistic assumption almost that what we're doing is actually sort of all right, or what we're doing already is enough to get out of the crisis we're in. And then combined with, I think, a version of environmentalism that you see in some parts of maybe not quite the environmental movement, but certainly where this has become mainstreamed, a lack of concern about the distributional impacts of some of this, whether it's inside countries that might be looking to make the just transition of changes to how people work and the industries they work in, or if you take the global level, then of course what happens if you say, well, perhaps you as this country can't industrialize in the way that we in the global north, whether it's Britain or North America or most of Europe, has industrialized over the last 200 years. There are a series of very big arguments that have bubbled up around this, centered around a sets of issues relating to the just transition, relating to the impact of growth, relating to how society can function, can continue to function, can even improve on what we're doing now, which, if you think about it, probably shouldn't be too hard, but do so and move towards a much more sustainable world in a just and fair fashion. So tonight's meeting, we've got three speakers, as I said. First up, and I'll go through them and introduce them in order and then take them one at a time from there, with time for discussion and Q&A at the end. First up, we're very lucky to have Jason Hickel, lecturer at LSE and author of the new book, Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World, followed by Sam Mason, who is PCS Union Policy Officer for Sustainability and Climate Change, long-standing trade unionist and climate movement activist, and then acting as a discussant from the PEF, the Progressive Economy Forum Council, is Ann Pettifor, economist and author of The Case for a Green New Deal. And I think, if memory serves, one of the original authors of the first Green New Deal proposal way back in 2009, which seems a painfully long time ago now, unfortunately. We'll have the first two speakers, Jason then Sam, who will introduce some of the themes of the evening. Then I'll ask Anne to come back in with a discussion, a kind of summary and maybe a response to some of what she said. If you do have questions or comments you'd like to make, there's a little box on your screen. It's the easy way to do it if you're online, is to just put them in there and I can bring back the speakers to respond and to continue discussion. We've got the thing booked out until about 6:30. So let's see how we go from here. And without further ado, I'd like on that note to introduce Jason Hickel, please.
Thank you very much, James. Let me just share my screen briefly here. Just give me a second. Is that visible to everyone then? Yeah. Okay, so I've got 20 minutes, and what I want to do with my time is basically to lay out the argument for why, if we want to have any chance of meeting our ecological goals, and if we want to do so in a socially just way, then rich economies like the United Kingdom are going to need to abandon capitalist growth as an objective. And this presents quite a significant challenge to the labor movements, which I want to grapple with a little bit tonight. And I'm going to argue this not as a critic from the outside of the movement, but rather as part of the movement itself. I've been a union member since I was 16 years old, working in construction, hospitality, and education. And I see the labor movement as key to achieving a just and ecological future. But to get there is going to require a significant change in the stance of the unions. Okay, so somehow over the past several decades, labor has come to align itself with capital, believing that capitalist growth is the best way to improve the livelihoods of the working class. So instead of challenging the primacy of growthism, unions dutifully line up to call for more of it. And this represents an extraordinary ideological coup on the part of capital, as it effectively neutralizes any meaningful opposition. And I mean ideology here in the strict sense, referring to a set of ideas that serves the capitalist class and is propagated by them, which the rest of us have effectively bought into in the mistaken belief that it is in our own interests. Okay, so to be clear about this, let's establish what growth actually is here. We tend to think of growth as an increase in use value or social value or human well-being or livelihoods or even public provisioning. But in fact, growth is none of these things. GDP growth is very narrowly defined as an increase in the aggregate production of commodified goods and services as valued in terms of market prices, right? So this is a measure that is explicitly designed to capture what is of interest to capital. And crucially, under capitalism, the point of constantly increasing production is not in order to meet concrete human needs. Rather, it is about extracting and accumulating profit, right? That is the overriding objective. And there's no identifiable endpoints to this process. Now, this process is inherently exploitative, and yet it's reframed and sold to the public in the language of growth. So growth is effectively a propaganda term, right? It sounds so natural and so good, right? Who could possibly be against growth? And the effect of this is that it gets us to buy into processes that we might otherwise reject. So as Timothy Mitchell has put it, growth is the alibi of capitalism. Now, not surprisingly, there's actually no direct causal relationship between GDP growth and human well-being. It all depends on what we are producing, how purchasing power is distributed, and whether people have access to core need satisfiers. So as we'll see, the challenge for socialists and eco-socialists must be to abandon aggregate growth as an objective and organize productive capacity around human needs and well-being. So that's what I'm going to try to establish tonight. But before I get into this, I want to start by setting out briefly where we're at with respect to the ecological crisis. So we're presently at 1.1 degrees of global warming. And of course, even at this level, the effects are absolutely disastrous. Already 30 million people are being displaced each year by climate breakdown, triggering major social and political upheaval. And we know that in order to stay under 1.5 degrees, global emissions have to be cut in half by 2030. And that's represented in this graph by the green line declining dramatically from historical trends. But so far, government pledges are nowhere near this target. Most people are not aware of this fact, but even if all countries uphold their pledges under the Paris Agreement, global emissions will not decline at all over the coming decade. And this brutal reality is represented by the blue line in this graph. And by the way, this accounts for the pledges that were made in Glasgow. Moreover, right now, existing government policies have us on track for at least 2.7 degrees of heating, which is way over the target and represents a profound failure of our governments, our international system, and portends a very dangerous future indeed. And I'm going to discuss why this is happening. But first, I want to mention briefly what the world is going to look like as we start to approach 3 degrees, so we have a sense of what the stakes are. We know that sea levels are projected to rise by 1 to 2 meters, which will swamp many coastal regions and coastal cities and significantly exacerbate coastal storm damage. Some 30 to 50% of the species on our planet will be wiped out, a figure that for me is actually almost too staggering to comprehend. And more than 1.5 billion people will be displaced from their homes, triggering mass migration on a scale that dwarfs anything we have yet witnessed. The yields of staple crops will decline significantly to the point where the UN warns of multi-breadbasket failure and sustained food supply disruptions globally. And I'm quoting from their texts, with famines potentially affecting several regions at once. So this is why Kevin Anderson, who's one of the leading climate scientists in the UK, routinely warns that 3 degrees is not compatible with organized human civilization as we know it. This is the reality that we face and is the future that we are headed toward. Now, we have a tendency to refer to this crisis in the language of the Anthropocene, which of course is useful in several respects, but it's also incorrect. It's not humans as such that are causing this problem. Rather, it's being driven by our economic system, which is capitalism, and is caused almost entirely by a small handful of rich economies in the global north, primarily to the benefit of their elites and corporations. Okay. This is perhaps clearest when it comes to the question of emissions. I want to establish here that the countries of the global north are responsible for the vast majority of the excess emissions that are causing climate breakdown. And by this, I mean emissions in excess of the planetary boundary of 350 parts per million concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. The USA is single-handedly responsible for 40% of excess emissions, the UK and EU for another 29%, and the global north as a group is collectively responsible for 92% of excess emissions, and that's represented here by the dark green. Meanwhile, the entire continents of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, home obviously to the vast majority of the world's population, are responsible for only 8% of excess emissions. That's in the light green in this graph. And most countries in the global south, including big nations like India, Indonesia, and Nigeria, are still well within their fair share of the planetary boundary and have not contributed to the problem at all, notwithstanding the protestations of the present government. So we need to understand this reality as a process of atmospheric colonization. The atmosphere is a shared commons on which all of us depend for our existence, and rich economies have effectively appropriated it for their own enrichment, with devastating consequences for all of life on Earth, and by the way, with dramatically disproportionate impacts on the territories of the global south. Okay, now the main reason for this extraordinary discrepancy is that the nations of the global north have extremely high levels of per capita energy use, roughly 10 times more than low-income countries, and several times in excess of what we know empirically is required for meeting human needs, even at a very high standard. And yet poverty, including energy poverty, is of course nonetheless widespread in countries like the UK and the US. And this is because most of our energy use is diverted toward production for the sake of corporate growth and elite consumption, rather than around meeting human needs. Okay. Now, crucially, climate is not the only crisis that we face. This reality tends to fall out of our dominant media discourse, but it's important, and I want to draw attention to it briefly. The global economy is presently overshooting several other planetary boundaries, including in terms of the rate of land system change, biogeochemical flows, species extinction, and the proliferation of novel pollutants such as industrial chemicals and plastics. Now, this overshoot is being driven overwhelmingly by excess material resource use. In other words, all of the material stuff that the global economy extracts and produces and consumes each year. And we can see in this graph, which shows global resource use rising dramatically over the past half century. And this red line that you see is what industrial ecologists say is the maximum sustainable boundary, 50 billion tons per year. And as you can see, we shot past that in the late 1990s. And this rising resource use trend is being driven by our pursuit of economic growth. There's a very tight coupling between GDP and material flows. For the past half century, economists have promised that more efficient technology and a shift towards services would decouple growth from resource use. But in fact, the opposite actually has occurred. Over the past 2 decades, a recoupling has happened. The global economy is becoming more resource intensive, not less. And as of 2020, we're now consuming over the maximum boundary by a factor of 2. And crucially here too, it's the rich countries that are overwhelmingly responsible for causing this problem. And this is clear when we look at this graph, which shows per capita resource use by country income group. Again, the red line is the maximum sustainable level. And we see here that rich countries on the far right consume on average 28 tons of resources per person per year, which is 4 times over the maximum sustainable boundary. And again, crucially, vastly in excess of what we know is required to meet human needs, even at a high standard. And again, this is because of the nature of the capitalist system of production, which prioritizes growth over human needs. Meanwhile, lower income countries clearly consume a small fraction of this and remain well within sustainable levels. And in most cases actually need to increase resource use in order to build the infrastructure required for human development. And I want to mention here also that here too, excess resource use represents processes of colonization. We know that growth in the global north relies on a large net appropriation of resources from the global south, right? In fact, it's equivalent to more than half of the total excess resource use in the countries of the global north. So in other words, northern economies enjoy the benefits of excess resource use, while the social and ecological damages of this, which are severe, are offshored to the territories of the global south. So we have to keep this imperial dimension in mind. So what needs to happen? Well, first of all, we know that rich countries need to scale down their use of the planet's resources. And I mean this quite dramatically, by more than half from existing levels. And by the way, the European Parliament has itself ratified this objective. Now, the existing dominant discourse claims that this can be accomplished through green growth. And the idea here is that efficiency improvements will allow us to achieve an absolute decoupling of GDP from resource use so that GDP can rise indefinitely, even while resource use declines. It sounds wonderful, but the problem here is that scientists reject this narrative as empirically baseless. We know that GDP growth remains tightly coupled to resource use, despite dramatic improvements in technology over the past few decades, and despite a strong shift to services. There's evidence, of course, of some relative decoupling in some cases, but no evidence of absolute decoupling. And all existing models, and this is important, all existing models project that it is unlikely to be achieved in the future, even under highly optimistic assumptions about efficiency and technological change. And these results have been confirmed by scientists several times over the past few years, including in major UN reports. And the main reason for this is that in growth-focused economies, gains from efficiency improvements are mobilized to expand the process of production and consumption, which makes absolute reductions very difficult to achieve. So in other words, it's not our technology primarily that is the problem here. The problem is our growth orientation, okay? So what this means is that if rich countries are going to achieve sufficient reductions in resource use, then they need to abandon growth as an objective. And in a post-growth or degrowth scenario, efficiency improvements will in fact work to yield significant reductions in resource use, but again, only in a post-growth scenario. Now, what about climate change? Remember that in order to stay under 1.5 degrees, we need to cut emissions to 0 by 2050. And high-income nations, given their disproportionate share of historical responsibility, have an obligation under the Paris Agreement to decarbonize much faster than that. So 2050 is not a legitimate objective for a country like the UK. It should be by 2030 or 2035 at the latest. Now, is such rapid decarbonization possible? This becomes the question. And the answer is yes, but not if high-income nations continue to pursue growth at the same time, right? And the reason for this is because growth is coupled to energy demands. So more growth means more energy demands than would otherwise be the case. And this graph gives us a sense for the coupling between GDP growth and energy demands indexed to 1970. We see a consistent relative decoupling, but no change in the relationship between these two variables. And this is a problem because more energy demands makes it more difficult and probably impossible to cover that demand with renewable alternatives in the short time we have left, right? And this is why climate action has so far failed to achieve any meaningful progress. This is why we are headed for 3 degrees. Now, politicians are aware of this conundrum, but they cannot bring themselves to face it, right? In order to reconcile the entrenched assumption of continued growth with the Paris Agreement pledges, they bet heavily on speculative negative emissions schemes to save us. This is literally at the center of existing plans to save the world, right? But scientists reject this assumption as highly dangerous. The technology has not been proven at scale. And if it fails, we will be locked into a hothouse trajectory from which it would be impossible to escape. It's a massive gamble with the future of all of life on Earth, all to defend continued growth in the global north, which we do not even need. Right? Okay, So now if we scale down our assumptions about negative emissions to what scientists suggest are reasonable, then the evidence is clear that to stay under 1.5 degrees, high-income nations will need to significantly reduce their use of energy. And the key thing here is that the less energy we use, the more quickly we can decarbonize the energy system. This is the core principle of climate economics, right? So in light of this evidence, ecological economists have been calling for a fundamentally different approach. The first step is to realize that high-income nations do not need more growth. After a certain level, which high-income nations have long surpassed, the relationship between aggregate commodity production and human welfare, unsurprisingly, totally breaks down. Again, what actually matters is what we are producing, how purchasing power is distributed, and whether people have access to core need satisfiers. This is what counts. And we know empirically that it is possible to meet human needs at a high standard with much less energy and resource use than rich countries presently use, and much less commodity production. This is extremely hopeful news. The key is to scale down less necessary forms of production while organizing the economy around human well-being rather than around capital accumulation. So this is what's known as degrowth. Degrowth calls for a planned reduction of excess resource and energy use in high-income nations to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a just and equitable way. So what does this look like in practice, very concretely? It's quite straightforward, actually. Instead of assuming that every sector of the economy must grow all the time, regardless of whether or not we actually need it to, we should decide what sectors of the economy we actually do need to improve. So things like renewable energy capacity, public transportation, healthcare access, and so on. And what sectors are clearly destructive and should be scaled down. Things like SUVs, private jets, air travel, fast fashion, industrial beef, advertising, finance, the widespread practice of planned obsolescence, right? The military industrial complex, and so on. There are clearly huge chunks of our production system that are organized mostly around corporate power and elite consumption, and we would be better off without them. Now, this approach is extremely powerful in terms of climate mitigation. And I want to emphasize this because it would significantly reduce energy use immediately and make it possible to achieve a rapid transition to renewables fast enough to stay under 1.5 degrees, right? So it brings 1.5 degrees back on the table entirely. And it would also reduce resource use and therefore reverse biodiversity loss and all other forms of ecological breakdown. So our planet would effectively begin to heal, right? Now, most people would regard this as sensible, except for one obvious sticking point. And this is where I want to conclude. What about jobs and livelihoods? As we scale down unnecessary economic activity, which we can agree needs to be done, won't that lead to unemployment? Clearly, this is politically untenable. Nobody would agree to such a future, and nor should they. Indeed, this is clearly already where the conversation is stuck. We cannot even talk about very simple steps like stopping airport expansion or closing coal mines or whatever it might be because of the specter of unemployment, okay? Now, ecological economists propose a very simple solution to this, which is simply to say that as our economy requires less labor to produce the things we need, we can shorten the working week and share necessary work more evenly, therefore preventing any unemployment. And the good news is that we know that shorter working hours also deliver big improvements in human well-being, health outcomes, and even gender equality. And also, this happens to be a resoundingly popular policy whenever it is polled. We also need to roll out a climate job guarantee. Such a program would ensure that anyone who wants to can train to participate in the most important collective projects of our generation, building renewable energy capacity, insulating homes, producing local food, and regenerating ecosystems. This would allow us to permanently end unemployment and ensure access to dignified, socially necessary work for all. The job guarantee is a mechanism that enables us to mobilize labor and around use value, right? Rather than around capital accumulation. And it allows us to set standards, furthermore, for wages and working hours across the whole economy. It's extremely powerful as a mechanism in this sense. The private sector would have to follow suit with whatever you establish, otherwise face losing staff. At the same time, we need to expand universal public services so that all people have access to the things they need to live good lives without requiring ever rising incomes in order to do so, okay? And here I mean not just healthcare and education, but also housing, public transportation, clean energy, water, nutritious food, internet, and so on, right? So I want to think briefly about the absurdity of a situation where in order to pay for something like education or housing, which are goods that already exist, we need to somehow produce more elsewhere in the economy in order to earn the income in order to do so, right? Therefore, producing things we don't need in order to access things that we do need and which are already there. So decommodifying the core means of survival is essential here. On top of this, we need to dramatically reduce inequality and distribute income more fairly. And this is really key. People often ask me whether there will be enough income in a degrowth scenario to meet human needs. And the answer to this is by definition, yes, right? Because we have to understand that income is simply the obverse of the total prices of all the stuff that the economy produces and consumes, right? There's always exactly, by definition, exactly enough income to buy everything that the economy produces. So as long as we are producing what people need, as long as we agree that we are producing what people need, then there will always, by definition, be enough income to buy all of those things, so long as purchasing power is distributed fairly. So distribution literally is everything here. And this can be accomplished in large parts by the first three policies I've listed here, as these would dramatically improve the bargaining power of labor. But we can also introduce a living wage policy to raise the floor at the bottom, while at the same time introducing wealth taxes and maximum income thresholds in order to prevent overaccumulation by the rich. So in conclusion, these four policies together establish a social guarantee. It would permanently end economic insecurity. It would permanently solve the problem of unemployment, and it would permanently decouple human well-being from economic growth so that we can pursue radical climate action without anyone getting hurt. In fact, while improving people's lives. This is the core of an eco-socialist transition. So think of the power of this. With this social guarantee in place, we are finally free to think more rationally about the economy. We can scale down less necessary forms of production. We can end planned obsolescence, et cetera, without ever thinking twice about the specter of unemployment. Indeed, such an objective is in line with basic principles of labor justice. There is zero reason that anyone should spend their lives doing labor for capital accumulation in sectors that are both socially less necessary and ecologically destructive, right? So this is what the labor movement should be fighting for. Indeed, this is the only political force that can get us where we need to be. Instead of aligning with capital and calling for more growth, hoping this will somehow magically solve the social problem, which of course it never does. We should solve the social problem directly. Shorter working week, job guarantee, universal public services, equality. These should be our objectives, and these are core to the possibility of an ecological civilization. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jason, for an excellent and detailed introduction to degrowth and its relationship to the just transition. I want to go now to Sam Mason from PCS, their policy officer on environmental and sustainability, for a kind of trade union, if you like, response to some of that and perhaps tackling some of the issues that Jason raised. Over to you, Sam.
Great, thanks, James, and thanks for the invitation to participate this evening, and thanks, Jason, for your introduction. I mean, it's fantastic and really thought-provoking, and I'm trying to read your book as well, so that's really helpful. I think I'll just start with a couple of things. I mean, I think one thing in the trade union movement, perhaps not exclusively, but the jobs versus environment issue, although not entirely settled, isn't quite as contentious perhaps I feel as it used to be some years ago. So we've got over a bit of the climate denial. I think we've got over a little bit of some of that. But the problem is about this whole just transition question, and actually what we think that future looks like and how we get there as well. So I just wanted to really set out some of the things that we're doing, working with the environmental movement and some of the bigger discussions going on, and, you know, a bit like Jason, conclude on some things which, you know, some of my personal reflections about what we need to be changing. Some of them are PCS, but they're not all explicitly PCS policy per se, but part of discussions I'm having within the wider labour movement. So first of all, I think it's quite important to remember a little bit about what happened last year in the year of the COP26 in Glasgow, because you know, we formed a COP26 coalition that actually went on for 2 years because of the delay to the COP and COVID, which was a really broad-based coalition of faith-based disability groups, you know, climate environmental NGOs, social justice campaigners, and of course trade unionists as well. And I think that has left us in, with the work that we did, and probably partly because we had the delay, has left us in a slightly better place in terms of our sort of networks and coalition going into this year as well. From the trade union side, we organised our own caucus within the coalition, which was partly based to help mobilise trade union participation in events leading up to the COP, and taking part in visible trade union blocks on the 6th of November on the Global Day of Action. And the reason for this was twofold. I mean, part of that sort of came because it emerged that a number of us as trade unions were involved, obviously in the climate work, but we thought it was really important to bring the labour movement debate into the climate movement and stress within our own unions that if we say workers need to be at the forefront of the just transition and design the new decarbonised economy, then we need to be visible within the climate movement with our demands and not just sort of shouting from the sidelines. But we also thought it's important to bring climate justice into trade unions and the wider labour movement struggles, and trying to link some of these together as these are not separate issues. So so again, I think, you know, we had some successes around that, you know, some quite amazing things have the GMB cleansing refuge workers who were on strike at the time in Glasgow being the sort of bodyguards for Greta Thunberg during the global climate strike on the 5th of November. But I think also, though, this isn't about us trying to dominate that wider space with so many groups. It's about an understanding of our positions and to enable us to cohere around a common agenda that meets our collective and what we think should not be exclusive aims of jobs, decarbonisation, recognition of the greater climate and environmental impact, particularly on the global south and the most vulnerable communities, including in our within the UK, and the race, gender and disability justice, amongst other things. But at the start of this year, when we're reflecting, because we are continuing on, we recognised it was going to be a real challenge to keep climate change and the decarbonisation agenda at the forefront of trade unions because of the cost of living crisis, because of the energy crisis, and now obviously with the war in Ukraine, it's an even harder discussion as energy security is being used opportunistically, particularly by Boris Johnson, to win out the outline of a jingoistic energy policy, which does little for the multiple crises we're facing, let alone for workers. Although, having said that, of course, I'm quite conscious that there are some trade unions that will be very favourable for some of the policy announcements that are coming out. And I think it's a real shame that in this rush to sort of de-Russify our energy system, that we haven't found quite the same incentive from the increasing alarm bells coming from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that last report just a few weeks ago that barely got mentioned, in which the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called an atlas of human suffering. And of course, that's not long after the groundbreaking report last year when he talked about Code Red for Humanity, etc., etc. So we've had a number of these building up, but I think, you know, anyone who's read any of the last report, I mean, it's quite sort of shocking what state we're at. And of course now, you know, we have this cost of living and energy crisis, which didn't just arrive with Ukraine, it didn't just arrive in January. And we are fundamentally on the blunt end of over a decade of austerity and the even blunter end of over 40 years of neoliberal capitalism, and a period of history in which we can chart also the exponential rise in greenhouse gas emissions and ecological destruction as well. And of course, in this whole period, we've seen the labour movement has suffered many defeats and trade union power diminish. But I think we have at times been good at defining the struggle industrially and politically, but we've all suffered because we've not always had unity as a class. We've not had enough trust in our own power, and when we did, it was failed by trade union bureaucracy or politicians who didn't agree on that power being invested in workers. And I'm making a specific reference here, but not exclusively, to the former Lucas Aerospace workers in the 1970s who developed the alternative corporate plan in the face of redundancies, and which started to talk about a new form of trade unionism and an understanding of the wider political and ideological nature of their struggle and the politicisation of technology, which required a different response rooted in workers' communities and the idea of socially useful production. So, you know, touching a bit on some of what Jason's covered in terms of, you know, production for the common good and not corporate profit or destructive goods, such as in the defence industry, which half of their sector was involved with. And I mention those because I think it's important not to lose sight that, you know, we're never on an entirely new page in our challenges, although arguably now we are up against a time challenge which we didn't have before in terms of what we need to do. The other thing I just want to touch on a bit briefly is obviously as we lurch from one crisis to the next. I think there's a few things to note and not lose sight of as well. So one of those is clearly in the pandemic and COVID, which we've just been through. And I think I'm sure many of us were involved in many discussions in that period online, reflecting about what that meant for the climate crisis. And I just look back at some of the notes and talks that I was involved in at the time, and was reminded, you know, McKinsey and Company noted this in terms of a physical shock versus financial shock, compared to the financial crash, and saw the current pandemic as a foretaste of what a full-fledged climate crisis could entail in terms of simultaneous exogenous shocks to supply and demand, disruption of supply chains, global transmission and amplification mechanisms. So, you know, and of course we saw kind of, you know, many things stand still, but of course we also saw in that time there was a magic money tree. We could repurpose production lines to produce things we urgently needed. We could pay workers to stay at home under furlough schemes, and overall we could work collectively where there was common interest to do so. Now, that is not to say that these were flawless processes, and there are many issues obviously around the awarding of contracts. You got to benefit from furlough, failure of our welfare system, and also globally of social protections, which is a key part of obviously our just transition narrative, and that many people in the world that actually have no social protection at all. But it reflected, you know, what some of the energy industry are calling for now in terms of moonshot approach to the energy and climate crisis, and some nervousness I'm picking up that they also don't necessarily, you know, some of the big industry players agree with the sort of approach that Boris Johnson has taken, and this talk about a dash for gas, for example. But of course, we have got to talk now to return to growth and productivity, the guarantee of prosperity and jobs. We saw this from both sides in the House of Commons yesterday in the spring budget. But what does it mean in reality? And I think for many of us, well, I'm not sure we hope much from these kind of theatre shows in the Commons, but there was no narrative there about the economy we need for the challenges that we face, and one which centres human needs and the needs obviously of our biosphere, and which enables, you know, life on Earth and socially useful production, not the market signals and the profit motive, including the energy profit energy system. And of course, we've been through decades, and I think, you know, Jason's touched on these obviously around the green growth and how that would save us, and how raising productivity and, you know, the need to be competitive to grow, generate projects, to create the mythical triple down economics of globalization, which of course never feeds through. And I think, you know, it's worth noting as well for those who saw the political declaration with the agreement with South Africa at the COP, which is designed to privatise their state-owned energy company. Not so there's not issues with that, the actual state-owned ExCom, but the emerging renewable sector as well, and in what trade union comrades in South Africa are calling the privatised transition. So no just transition for them. And of course, they also make the points about, the huge challenges that they have in countries like South Africa, just around energy poverty and, huge unemployment and issues like that, which we have to consider. But part of me also thinks we need to stop talking about a green economy and green jobs. And in fact, we also prefer to talk about climate jobs, jobs that are going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not going to talk about jobs numbers either. I think there's been loads of brilliant studies about jobs that can be created, transitioning, from North Sea oil and gas to renewables, etc. But we need to try and understand, obviously, the mechanisms that are going to make us actually for these transitions to happen. But I think we do need to start talking about what is a human nature survival economy. Because we need an economy that's built around a very serious plan for the UK, but obviously globally as well. We're not in isolation for the challenges that we face, and which reframes the current just transition debate, which is largely around the Northern development model and a green capitalist jobs swap, and very, very narrow. It doesn't deal with gender issues, it doesn't deal with race issues. It excludes many people even from within our own economy around that narrative in the way in which we talk about it. And also that it's not just about, fossil fuels versus wind energy or renewables, but our entire energy system and what we use energy for, how we extract resources for it, how we share our knowledge and technology and develop these as global public goods as well. So part of that is about stopping and reversing the neoliberal privatisation and commodification of energy, and this is part of work that we're doing through the Global Trade Unions for Energy Democracy initiative and a programme that was launched at the COP there as well. And I think I just want to remind that, in the pandemic, I think we also failed one of our very first just transition tests, and we failed it very miserably, and this was in the aviation sector, where we had a real opportunity to relook at aviation, to actually change that and invest in other parts of the economy. And PCS worked with Green New Deal UK and the Greenhouse think tank developing a Green New Deal for Gatwick. That was an area that was massively impacted, including with PCS members who lost their jobs, and also an area that's highly dependent on that airport, and just looked at the nature of the work that was needed around there in social care and education, etc. We weren't arguing that, if you were cabin crew, you could just go into social care, but trying to do a proper analysis. Actually, there was lots of work there that was needed to be done, and we didn't need to revive an aviation sector there for those jobs as well. But that was a missed opportunity, and also a missed opportunity of unions working together to actually put forward a different narrative around this, and certainly we did try. And I think the other thing we need to be mindful of, that we're now in danger that just transition is becoming derided as a term for workers for many different reasons. But I think some of those, because workers aren't seeing themselves as protected, they aren't offered the assurance of security that workers in their community would be trampled on again, as we've seen through other waves of economic restructuring, and obviously the deindustrialization, which is now commonly referred to. And this is evidence in the jobs that didn't come the way of workers in Scotland, resulting from the offshore wind energy investment, or likewise when we see the treatment of the P&O workers last week, or the hundreds of British gas engineers who were sacked under fire and rehire last year. So where is our just transition guarantees in these? So therefore, I'm just going to come to a few points that I think we need to consider it if we want a real just transition. And we argue that it needs to be a transformative transition that addresses the inherent inequality of the capitalist system. And so for us, I think this entails several things. One, we have to address issues of ownership. We need to take into public ownership key sectors which are critical to meeting decarbonisation and ecological needs, starting with the energy sector. And this needs to be coupled with models of democratic control and participation in those sectors. And indeed, if workers have shorter working week, they'll have more time to actually have participatory democracy and actually run some of these things. We need planning and a clear plan. We need to make a clear assessment of the resources and technology needed to make these transitions, not least with the move to electrify everything and the enormous resource demand that entails. We're in a policy mess right now, and it's not sufficient just to say we need renewable energy, as this too, as Jason's already pointed out, has got extraction issues, particularly in the global south, which we need to consider. There's other environmental impacts we need to understand related to that. But above all, we need to know and have one plan about where we're transitioning to, who it impacts, where, and work collectively to achieve that plan, not just in energy, but across transport, construction, agriculture, the whole economy and all sectors. We need a Just Transition Act, which guarantees workers and community a right to no detriment or loss as a result of transition. And investment in future work, it's not just about the current workers, we need jobs for future workers as well, and they need financial security and that future generations will be protected, and that would entail things as well around guarantees to training and reskilling, for example, which is outside of employer-led training, and we know generally that employers don't want to invest if it's not going to be for their business, so we need those guarantees outside of that. As part of this, we also need a new social security settlement. This is not just about welfare payments, although clearly that's part of it, but we need an architecture of security that recognises the invaluable role of our key workers in schools, health, social care, transport, cleaning and refuge workers, the public sector, civil service workers, who we saw as the fabric of our wider social security during the pandemic, and which we all relied upon at that time. And and I think there's just a point which Philip Alston, I'm not sure if he still is, but when UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights made the note that, that extreme poverty is not just about a lack of income, it's a lack of access to basic services and social exclusion. And I think that has to be understood as part of this wider social protections and social security. We need to repeal the anti-trade union laws, agree new labour rights and labour law. We hardly ever talk about labour law in just transition terms. Our labour law is modelled obviously on the capitalist need to bargain within that framework. So we are trapped within that. So we need to look at that. And also, the fact that we have less collective agreements, and less access to social dialogue and consultations, which are all things embedded within the notions of just transition as well. So, and I think, that there is some academics looking at this more particularly in Canada that said we need a new legal model that promotes public voice and includes a theory of justice that recognises there will be cost and benefits to societies associated with climate change, and which should be distributed in an equitable manner, but it's also about bringing together parts of labour law, and environmental justice law as well. So I think that's a sort of interesting way to also start looking at some of these challenges. We need a new trade unionism. I think that is one of our barriers. I think the aviation example that we had showed that it was very difficult to work collectively because our own mode of trade unionism is actually built on competition with each other and for members. I think the ideas, and certainly people like Sharon Graham in Unite have talked about this in the Combined, and this is exactly this is again these ideas which came out of the Lucas Plan example, actually working across unions. We cannot be competing with each other for membership of the jobs. We're going to redesign the economy and what this looks like. We have to start thinking differently about that as well. And I think the final thing is, our allies in the environment, with our allies in the environmental movement as trade unionists, we need to build our collective power. And, through the TUED work that we've done, they've talked about social dialogue or social power, and the need that the insistence on keeping social dialogue at the centre of such discussions holds trade unions debates captive to the narrative of the neoliberal business establishment and to a very narrow and demobilising interpretation of just transition. I know there's many that don't agree with that, but that's certainly an argument which we agree with. And finally, I just wanted to say, because we throughout this term just transition, it's become very popular, but I always like to remind people about where this actually came from. And you know, many of you here I'm sure may know, but it's a term that emerged in the US by the visionary labor leader Tony Mazzarchi from the Oil and Chemical and Atomic Workers Union, and it was based on a very simple idea of a super fund for workers. So just as the, you know, the sunsetting of corporations as part of environmental legislation in the US benefited from a super fund, you thought, well, why shouldn't the workers? Because they actually weren't getting anything from this. So, you know, obviously it then emerged into a different discussion around just transition. But I think it's another important part here, and to bring it back into today's context, as part of that, he well understood that if workers weren't looked after, they would politically turn to the right. This is what we're seeing taking place today, and at a moment where Nigel Farage is now, you know, with his attack on the net zero strategy, and of course we all criticise the net zero strategy, but obviously, you know, he's going to say this is going to be a cost to the working class, and you know, the red wall. We have to be really careful about this, and as trade unionists, how we talk about this. As well. So I think I just finished in saying, therefore, we need a transformative just transition that has to be seen within a framework of economic, social, environmental and political justice. And that's why I think, you know, hopefully the alliances that we built and we can continue to build and have these kind of discussions, that we can actually start to change some of the narrative and recognise that, of course, as trade unionists, you know, we've got to do the first response, reactive to response, what's happened immediately today, such as we saw with the P&O workers, but we also have to start changing about how we see this transition and where we're going to engage with these ideas as well, and start to be visionaries around this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sam, for a really really good overview and a sort of political and trade union political context for some of the comments that Jason made and the wider sort of situation with trade unions. I thought particularly getting into institutional legal questions at the end. I mean, what is the form of the transition? What changes do we need to make to laws? What kind of agency do we need to bring to bear in this? I want to hand over to Ann Pettifor now for a sort of comments and discussions before we move to questions and comments from the, well, I won't say the floor, but the kind of ether that the rest of you are sitting in. Anne, if you'd like to take it away.
First of all, thank you, James, for that. And thank you, Jason and Sam, for very excellent and also comprehensive presentations. On the question of degrowth, I have to say how strongly I support the movement, the whole degrowth movement, because what it's doing is actually tearing down the kind of major pillar of trying to tear down, if you like, the major pillar of neoliberal economics and therefore of capitalism, absolutely the fundamental edifice that holds up capitalism. And so in that sense, it's an extremely important movement and incredibly valuable. And I want to just say how much I agree with Jason about how we should address basic needs, which are finite, which are limited, as opposed to our infinite wants or desires, which are infinite, and so on and so forth. So there's an awful lot that I do agree with in Jason's presentation, but also in Sam's. But I'm going to be controversial and suggest that, number one, the project, the degrowth project, is a utopian project. And I'm in favor of utopia, and I'm in favor of utopians. But it's utopian in its strategy, in my view. And that brings me to the whole question of labor, the trade union movement, and workers, and what this transformation will mean for ordinary people, for working people. And I want to do that because for me, I want to give us an analogy, for example. I mean, imagine You know, we're in a huge Boeing plane, and there's, I don't know, 300 people on the plane, and the plane is about to crash, right? And we're running around saying, we've got to persuade the people on the plane that we're about to crash. We've got to help them understand that we're about to crash, right? And until we do, you know, we're not going to be able to stop the crash. And I want to argue that no, you know, the passengers on the plane are likely the victims, but they are not the architects of the system which is about to crash. Those are the aeronautical engineers who, for example, may not understand a fundamental force in economics, gravity, or who've misunderstood it and have created a plane which is going to crash. And in that sense, I want us to be focusing, instead of on the crowd, on the millions of people, the innocent people, both in the North and the South, who are not responsible for this crisis and who are not major beneficiaries of this crisis, that instead of focusing on them, we ought to be focusing on the top 10% responsible for most of the world's emissions. And I include myself in that, and my generation, right? We are the ones responsible for these emissions. And I'm in that bracket. But there are the 1% is an even more important section of that bracket, and are responsible for a huge amount of emissions, whereas the 90% are not on the whole responsible for bringing us to this brink of crisis. And just as we need to be able to blame the aeronautical engineers responsible for that plane and the fact that it's about to crash, so we should be responsible for the architects of the capitalist system that is leading us into disaster, and those are economists. That is the economics profession. Growth is as fundamental to economics as gravity is to physics. It's absolutely central. It's a central pillar of neoliberal economics. And therefore, the attack on it is absolutely the right attack. But to widen that attack to the whole population of the world and ask us all that we've all got to change our behavior, this is to fall into the trap that the oil companies have set, for example, when they invented the term carbon footprint. They made all of us responsible for the mess that we're in, and by doing so, make us all feel paralyzed in a sense. What can we do? What can I do to change the system? Very little. But economists can do a great deal. Economists that draft the IPCC reports, which cheat around the accounting of emissions, and that, for example, exclude aviation and shipping, or exclude emissions generated by the outsourcing of our emissions. Those kinds of economists are at the heart of this problem. And in my view, the left is missing a trick when it aims its fire at the 90% and ignores the 10% or even the 1%. And it seems to me that a far more sound strategy would be to focus on the greatest emitters of all, and to demand that they make a transformation. So Kevin Anderson, you've already quoted him, Jason, has said that if we force the top 10% to cut their carbon footprint to the level of the average European, the result would be that we cut a third of emissions, global carbon dioxide emissions. You know, we have not managed to cut any globally, we have not managed to cut carbon emissions. We keep loading the atmosphere with additional emissions. And I think that's partly because of the flaw in the strategy of trying to tackle this issue. We get the sort of reaction we got from the Gilets jaunes, where there's a baker with a little white van somewhere in rural France who has no alternative form of transport, and who then has the burden of tax added to his costs, and he's blamed for a situation that, or she, that is not responsible for. Equally, by making trade unionists feel bad about the fact that they're trying to exist and trying to survive within this rapacious capitalist system, it seems to me, is to invite Nigel Farage to capture that audience, right? So I want us to rethink our strategy in this, and I would like to see the degrowth movement focus far more relentlessly on the economics profession, because growth is absolutely fundamental to all of economics. And if we could undermine its credibility within economics, we could begin to start thinking about alternative systems where we meet basic needs, but not infinite wants. So I think that's my real challenge around this debate, which is a really good one. I mean, this movement is a really important movement, but the firepower, if you like, is too dissipated, is too wide, and is not going to enable us to gain power, gain political power, because we need to do that, and gain the kind of influence and impact that we need to have. I have also huge reservations about number one, job guarantee, and number two, universal basic income. I think they far too closely resemble workfare programs, such as that developed under the Clintons and also here in Britain. And I think they become incredibly bureaucratic and kind of Soviet-style bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy required to guarantee every single person a job and to match every single person to a job means you're going to get into some, in my view, quite unpleasant kind of social control on the one hand. And I think universal basic income is just unaffordable, and also doesn't really address the issue. And that's why I'm part of the social guarantee, which argues basically for universal basic services. But I'll leave that at that, and let's have the debate.
Okay. Thank you, Anne, for what was, gosh, there was quite a lot in there in terms of people, things to respond to and points raised. I mean, there was a couple of things I think I took from it, which I'm going to put to the rest of the panel now, and then we can move to some question and answers. I think perhaps we're circling around the issue of agency, I suppose, which is who is it that's actually going to make a lot of these things happen? Is it necessary to say that we must have workers on board, or is there some bureaucratic force that's going to make this occur for us? Do we look to build a movement which says not that you need to change your lifestyle in particular, that you don't have to change your form of consumption? Is it ever going to be enough to say, well, okay, the top 10% can do this? I think Andreas Malm has a version of this, which is just focus everything on the fossil fuel companies in particular. That's the kind of weak link of the whole system. Go for them, and then everything else we can sort of deal with later. I parody his argument slightly. But I wonder if perhaps Jason would like to respond directly to some of the issues that Anne raised there.
Yes, Anne, thanks so much. It's good to see you, and it's good to hear what you're thinking about these days. So I agree with a lot of what you say, actually, but let me see if I can advance things a bit. So I think it's important to actually recognize how degrowth is fundamentally different from the standard mainstream environmentalist movement. The standard environmentalist movement argues that it's about individual responsibility, right? Carbon footprints, et cetera, et cetera. Degrowth rejects this by pointing to the fact that we have to pay attention to the underlying structural driver of this problem, which is the dependency of a capitalist economy on perpetual growth, right? And so for me, even focusing on the elite 10%, these people, the way I see it, which also, by the way, includes us, is an effect of this economy, right? Like overconsumption and inequality is an effect of the capitalist economy. And so what degrowth calls for, again, is a more systematic approach here. So now, it's true that degrowth is utopian in its goals. There's no question. But it is possible to achieve. But what it requires now, and I think this is really what the movement is missing, is something like a revolutionary strategy, right? So the past decade of ecological economics research that produced degrowth as a movement has been focused on demonstrating empirically that it is possible to have a degrowth scenario and at the same time meet human needs at a high standard. That now is demonstrated. And so now the question becomes, how do we bring this about? And I personally think it's impossible for the environmentalist movement alone to accomplish this transition. They don't have the political power required. In alliance with unions, they do, I think, have a shot at it. And this is why I do think that speaking to the unions is absolutely vital, because without this, I honestly think we are lost. This requires bringing unions on board with a post-growth vision. which is not about blaming working class people or unions for any stance. On the contrary, it is about doubling down on achieving their core social objectives, which is to end unemployment and produce better livelihoods, right? And ensure better livelihoods, right? My argument is simply that this should not be done. This should not be achieved through the pursuit of growth. This should be achieved directly through the social guarantee. Okay. I mean, think about the power of a public job guarantee to the labor movement. It would eradicate so many of the things that they actually seek to address. It's very powerful in this sense. It would dramatically improve the bargaining power of labor, prevent economic insecurity. To the question of the job guarantee and UBI, let me briefly summarize my position here. The problem with UBI, while I'm a supporter of it, is simply that it does not provide a mechanism to allocate labor, right? Now, we know that when people have a UBI, they don't just do nothing, right? David Graeber very brilliantly demonstrated this. They actually, like, people actually want to be involved in doing things, producing things of value, use value. But this does not mean that they will even if you do want that, you might not automatically spontaneously be able to insulate a house or install solar panel capacity, et cetera, right? We actually need some kind of mechanism to ensure people can train for that sort of thing. And this is where a job guarantee is very powerful, because these are things that the private sector is not going to do. It does fall to the public sector to do these things. Now, the literature on a job guarantee is very clear that it should be decentralized in most of its functions, democratic and decentralized. So communities decide what they need. And this is a way of democratizing the process of production itself, which I think is also something that socialists should want to achieve. No? So this is not, to me, like a command and control job system. It's something quite different. Now, and I should say, the reason I think it's so important is precisely because of what Sam was talking about. When I listen to Sam, I hear that there's this, it's a whack-a-mole situation where we're trying to deal with industry by industry. A little thing happens in some industry and we have to deal with unemployment, and it never works. People get upset and hurt. We need some standardized mechanism that makes it unnecessary for us to do this on an industry by industry basis, right? The public job guarantee, I think, accomplishes this so that we don't have to constantly fight this battle. It should be a permanent mechanism that allows us to reorganize our productive capacities around use values rather than around capitalist accumulation. I think that the UBI should complement it, basically because not all people can work or may have very good reasons to not work. And we should recognize that fact and ensure that people can access a universal basic income should they need to. But I suspect that the public job guarantee option, if we're in charge of it, would be desirable for people. Who would not want to leave their job flipping burgers for McDonald's for minimum wage in order to participate in the most important collective projects of our generation for a dignified living wage? Few people would reject that opportunity. Now, I just want to wrap up by saying one additional thing here, which is that I'm actually somewhat disturbed by the need of the labor movements and many in the progressive tradition to try to convince people that the transition will be okay because we'll be having more jobs, right? So there will be a net increase in jobs, and we have so many reports trying to prove this and so on. And then, of course, the right comes back and says, no, it's going to be less jobs. It doesn't matter, ultimately, if there are more jobs or fewer jobs. The only thing that matters in an economy is not the number of jobs or how much labor is being performed. What matters, okay, is what we are producing. Is our productive capacity meeting, actually achieving what we need to in terms of meeting human needs? If we are producing enough, what is necessary, then you immediately simply distribute the necessary labor more evenly by shortening the working week, right? It should never be a question of, do we need more jobs? It should be a question of, do we need more production or less production in aggregate? And so I really think that the question of jobs is like this, it's a worm in our minds from capitalism that emerges from our dependency on wage labor for survival, right? It's an artificial scarcity of employment that plagues industrial economies and which we needn't have. We should permanently end that artificial scarcity through the mechanisms that I've proposed. And then we would not be in this endless debate over will the transition produce more jobs or less jobs? Again, it doesn't matter. This is my position.
Thank you, Jason. I'm just going to hand over to Sam for her own response to Anne and perhaps to what Jason said as well.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I mean, I need to spend more time reading about the degrowth theory. So I think I've had quite a superficial understanding of it until I started reading some of Jason's book and hearing you tonight. I mean, the most criticism I get, and understandably, is from comrades in the global south, because they think this is a luxury of the north to have a degrowth theory with so much development and, you know, issues that they need to tackle. And of course, when we say the global south, it's not a homogenous thing. There's many variations in the global south as well. So I think, yeah, I think it is important that, you know, we don't blame the workers. I mean, I do agree as well. It's like focusing on the 10% or the 1% more specifically. You know, I think for us, the big challenge is the corporations, and certainly one of my frustration in just transition debates is that, you know, somehow we can go at a plant level or workplace level, have a nice cozy conversation, we'll work out a just transition agreement, and, you know, this will be it. And mostly what we'll be working out is a redundancy agreement, rather than any kind of agreement that's either securing future employment or the kind of more general livelihoods within that community as well, because we know the decisions are not being taken on the shop floor by the bosses there. They're being done in boardrooms, and, you know, Shell's got their strategy, etc. So I think that's where we need to tackle it. You know, and certainly this is a very strong thing that came out of the Lucas plan. You know, people don't go necessarily to choose and work in the places that they do. You know, you leave school, you want a job, you go to work. If that's the employer, that's where you end up. And I think we also have to recognize that workers are thinking people, they're not abstract, you know, so a lot of stuff gets reported through their sort of leadership or people like me. You know, they know what's going on, they see the crisis around them. You know, they have children that are going on climate strikes, so they're aware of all these things. And it's about how we actually ensure workers are brought into the conversations in meaningful ways to redesign. And I think different unions do that differently. And, you know, and we have political differences across our movement, and we have to acknowledge that. Some don't want to change or have to transition in the way they're very rooted to their origins and how they've grown up as a union. And I think there are big challenges there as well. And I think, you know, to be honest, sometimes they hide quite a lot of the reality and debate that's going on as well. So but I think we do that by building as we are, that, you know, through mechanisms like the Global Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, that includes a huge number of unions in the UK, right across the globe now, and has grown significantly since it first started in 2012. And that its core message is really about, you know, resist, reclaim, restructure. So resisting the fossil fuel corporations. I mean, I think we might expand that more widely now. You know, reclaim them back into public ownership and restructure them in a way that works for workers and our communities. And I think part of that is really much, it's also about having these universal public services as well, rather than, you know, universal basic income. It's not something that we've generally supported in the trade union movement. And I think, you know, it's about having those services, and why we're now trying to obviously foster this debate around, you know, energy being a public good. It shouldn't be seen as this commodity that's traded, and, you know, this terrible situation that we're in now, and very acutely in the UK because of the way our markets are, the design of our energy markets. And, you know, and I just find these really quite banal discussions that we're having. It's like we will just tinker a little bit with the markets. Our transition shouldn't be dependent on that as well. So, you know, I think these are all things to consider, and it is a big challenge. And I think a lot of this challenge also is about a lot of education. I don't mean that in a patronizing way, but I think one thing that's been shown up through the current energy crisis is that a lot of people don't really understand very well how the energy system works, including environmentalists, and we've got to get smart about this. You know, and if we want to challenge some of our unions who are actually still supporting the fossil fuel agenda, we've got to do it in terms of where, you know, they do know the areas. You know, we can't, whatever we feel about their positions on things, they know very well, you know, the areas. So yeah, I'll just finish on that.
Thank you, Sam. I want to pick up. There's a couple of questions. There's actually quite a few questions that have come in now, but take a few of them together. One from Elena and Mark, which is really, it's about financing. They both sort of go around this issue about how might we pay for the transition. That won't it be necessary to just whack up taxes to a very great extent? Can governments borrow? And then a question about, could we use maybe quantitative easing that Elena identifies here? Are there mechanisms that we can put into place rapidly that would actually provide the finance to make any kind of transition happen, whatever sort of direction you want to take that in? And perhaps I'll take that to Anne first, who obviously has written a very great deal about financing over the years. Perhaps she wants to pick up on that one. And you'll need to unmute yourself.
Thanks, James. Yes. So the question of financing, you know, is really, it's really not the problem. We have developed a monetary system, and in the North, broadly speaking, we have developed and stable monetary systems. There are countries in Africa that don't have stable and organized monetary systems, and therefore have no money. It's not complicated. They don't have a monetary system, largely because they've been discouraged by the IMF and the World Bank not to invest in a monetary system, and instead to rely on dollars coming from abroad in the form of aid. And so, you know, we need to appreciate what a wonderful thing a monetary system is. It enables us to do what we can do. Now, the question is, who runs and who controls the monetary system? Well, right now, the monetary system is run and controlled in the interests of the 1%. And because most of us are really deeply uninterested in the monetary system and don't want to understand how it works, and the fact that it's international and globalized, and we don't really go there very much, the 1% continue to run the show. And I think, you know, what we're going to need is to have much more democratic oversight and regulation of the monetary system in the interests of the people. And once we have that, then there'll never be a shortage. There's not a shortage of money. What there's a shortage of is the resources, as Jason has pointed out, the finite nature of the assets, the Earth's assets that we have to claim, to extract. And B, there's a shortage of what to spend it on. And the decision about how to spend is really the most political decision. We worry a lot about where's the money going to come from. The Tories would like us, the Conservatives would like us to worry endlessly about where the money comes from, but not to worry about how it's spent. And for me, that is going to be the really crucial issue, how those decisions are going to be made. And it's the way in which our ability to create credit effectively out of thin air, that's what QE is, and that's what, you know, applying for a loan from the bank is about. But the question becomes not whether or not we know we have the capacity to do that, to create that finance. The question then becomes, how do we spend it and what do we spend it on? I'm not a modern monetary theorist. I think there's some good in modern monetary theory. A lot of it is true, and a lot of it is really helpful, and it's certainly triggered a lot of public debate and awareness. But there's an assumption in modern monetary theory that the government prints money, and that's not the way the monetary system works. And even if it were, we cannot have unlimited, just like you cannot have unlimited growth. So you can't have unlimited growth in credit either. So that has to be managed and regulated. So that's why I have the real reservations, because MMT gives the impression that there needs to be no limit on the availability of finance, and I don't think that's the case. Does that answer the question, James? Was it that one?
I think so. I think that gets some distance into it. I wonder if I could maybe pick Jason up on that, who I think has written quite favourably about MMT in the past. And if you have a response to, because it's the obvious, critique that springs to my mind is that if you start saying, okay, well, we're going to create money and this is going to pay for things, you are starting to build in quite a powerful mechanism towards reinforcing growth. So perhaps if Jason wants to pick up on what Ann's just been saying there.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, there's a large segment of the MMT scholarship that I think unthinkingly has kind of thought of MMT as an important way of generating growth, right? So my argument is that the very same tools can actually be used towards a post-growth transition. And what you do basically is you issue the public currency, as Ann has described, to fund the transition that we need in terms of renewable energy capacity, the public job guarantee, universal public services, and so on. These can be funded directly by issuing the currency. What this effectively does is it increases the government's command over resources and labor in the economy, right? Now, this is going to increase, okay, that increases demand, right? This is going to increase inflation unless you do one of two things. A, you expand productive capacity, which is what most of MMT suggests we should do. Or B, we reduce excess demand. And this is what degrowth suggests we should do. So MMT is interesting because it is noted that taxation is the main mechanism for reducing excess demand, not a mechanism for funding public services. And so therefore, we can deploy this mechanism to reduce the demand of the rich. This should be the objective of taxation. So you issue the currency to fund the transition, and then you reduce excess demands through taxation by actively cutting the purchasing power of the rich to the point where they're literally no longer rich. So Ann is right. There is a limit to how much you can issue without inflation. And MMT's argument is you deal with that through either increasing production or curtailing demand through taxation. We should go hard for curtailing demand, specifically of the rich, or of specific product categories that we want to either significantly slow down or eliminate, such as, for example, SUVs or commercial air travel and so on. So I think the two really work very well together. And there's now a huge community of scholars working on integrating degrowth and MMT theory as we speak, several dozen scientists involved. So it's quite exciting to see where it will go.
Thank you, Jason. I want to actually, this is quite opposite. There's a question from Gillian, which I think fits in perfectly with what you were just saying. So perhaps I'll take that back to yourself and to Ann especially. But which is Gillian asks, well, if we immediately move to tax or limit sort of elite consumption, if we go after the top 10% or the top 1% to try and cap their emissions, which she says that Branko Milanovic, the economist, wealth economist, has suggested, won't we immediately get into a sort of COVID-style economic crisis? So you've just gummed up the whole mechanism, you've stopped all this consumption, and then suddenly you'll find mass recession everywhere. I mean, this is quite a broad question, I think, and again, about what the mechanisms of transition are. But I'm wondering what people think about that suggestion that taxing the rich might be dangerous for this economy because you'll collapse consumption and therefore collapse growth and therefore collapse everything about our ears. Maybe if I go to Ann for that one first.
I don't think it's dangerous to tax the rich. I think it's really about time that we did. And I don't think it's dangerous to cut consumption. The fact of the matter is that it's consumption and extraction and exploitation and appropriation which is leading to the generation of emissions, which is suicidal for humanity. So I don't have any problem with that at all. Now the thing is, what would be important? First of all, I think by forcing the rich to give up their yachts, their super jets, their huge mansions, which all are used for emitting carbon dioxide. We begin to close down on the carbon emission of carbon, which is terribly important. But then we need to manage, if you like, the process and here we come to the just transition, and the management of what we can consume and what we can produce is, I think, properly defined by Jason as focusing on human needs. And there are a finite amount of human needs. Nutritious food and water is essential, protective housing, security in childhood, physical security, basic education, safe birth control. These are things that actually the economy should be focused on. And that, in my view, will take an awful lot of employment. I have to say, I have to disagree with Jason here. I come from South Africa. My family are all there. I haven't lived there for 50 years, but I know that unemployment amongst young Black people in South Africa is higher than 50%. There is nothing worse than having a vast population without meaningful work, without meaningful work, and without income. And in my view, the transition is going to involve focusing instead on basic needs, which satisfy our sense of well-being and security, and which can be labor intensive. And so, for example, in my ideal Green New Deal economy, the care sector is going to be a much bigger part of the economy than, say, for example, the oil and gas sector is going to be. That's going to be closed down. Care sector is going to be expanded. Care of babies, care of children in education, care of the vulnerable, care of the elderly. That's got to be a big part, and it's got to be a respected work. It's got to be trained and skilled work, and it's got to be paid work, really. And there's so much work to be done, in that sector. But then there's work to be done, and dealing with floods, dealing with climate breakdown, and so on. So the idea that there's going to not be enough work to be done, and we should all therefore be on shorter working hours and all not working at all, I think is, again, utopian. There is a hell of a lot of work to be done in an economy which is now no longer focused on consumption, but is instead focused on basic needs.
Okay, thank you. And I want to take this sort of last question and make it a last round of responses. Oh, yeah, sure. Sorry, yeah, no, Jason, you should have a response to that, I think.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm not understood here. I'm not misunderstood here, because your remarks about South Africa make me wonder if I was misunderstood. So degrowth is about the global north. And this responds also to Sam's question. It's about countries that have an excess of productive capacity, right? Not about countries that have a deficit of productive capacity. So in South Africa, clearly, there is an absence. There's actually a deficit of labor mobilized around meeting human needs. More needs to be done there, clearly. And South Africa was a great place to introduce a job guarantee precisely to do that, to mobilize labor around building houses, et cetera, et cetera. In rich countries, I actually don't know. We don't actually know this, and it needs empirical research. We don't know whether in the degrowth scenario we propose, where I agree there will be much more care work, et cetera, whether there will be an increase in the necessity for paid employments or a decrease. We don't actually know. It really depends on the labor intensity of the sectors we're scaling down versus those that we're scaling up. But my point here is not to say if we need to reduce total labor contributions, my point here is not to say that there will be any unemployment at all. My point is to say there will be zero unemployment by sharing labor more evenly, right? So I object to any possibility of anyone facing any involuntary unemployment. That's important. Now, very basically, what I'm trying to get across here is this. The question again should not be jobs. The question should be production, and because labor is ultimately about producing things. This is the facts. So we should never ask if we need more jobs. We should ask, do we need more production of specific things? What are those things, and how can we get them, right? How can we mobilize labor around those things? So this is very similar to what Simon Kuznets himself pointed out, the architect of GDP. He said we should never pursue aggregate growth as such. We should always ask growth of what, for what purposes, and for who. And I think this is the question we need to always be asking about, the question of production, and therefore the question about labor. More productive labor for what and for who needs to be our question here. And I think that any socialist this should be core to what we believe, because a wasteful expenditure of labor for the sake of capital accumulation should surely run against every meaningful socialist principle that we can articulate. So I think that we're not too distant, actually, Anne, from each other's perspectives here. I just want to clarify my position.
Thanks for that. And it does still lead into what I want to take as a sort of final question, what has been a very, very good discussion. One from Jilly, who says, is it the case that we should not seek to satisfy infinite wants, as Anne mentioned, or rather should we seek to change what it is that we want? And I think that's been kind of implicit in a lot of what we're saying. I mean, implicit in a lot of the discussion here has been some things are just sort of better. We would like to see more care work and presumably fewer transatlantic flights. You know, there's a kind of value judgment we're applying here. But Jilly continues, I'm thinking of Kate Soper's ideas of alternative hedonism and the cultivation of different kinds of desire. Surely we will still have desire in a degrown world. Jilly throws out to everyone there. So I think there is something here that also gets into, well, what do we do if we start thinking about changing what people want to consume? I mean, are we going to force them to do this? Are we going to compel them? Is there a mechanism to make this happen that doesn't involve the kind of compulsion that I think Anne referenced there? And I wonder if perhaps I should go back to Jason in that one and then take the rest of the panel.
Yeah, my concern about the question of like individual consumption. Look, I think that actually, again, it's too downstream for me. We should go upstream. So it's very easy for us to take long haul flights at the touch of a button, right? For very cheap, actually, relative to the expenditure of energy and emissions that it involves and the destruction that it causes. So look, I mean, we need a system that scales down commercial air travel and rations it. Recognizing that some people actually will have legitimate need to travel across the world for some purpose, but a one-day business meeting does not count as that, right? So look, like here, it's not about us trying to figure out how to reduce our consumption, although of course we must do that. This is never going to be enough in a system that requires us to increase consumption in order to keep this system afloat. You know? So to me, this is important. And yeah, like I think, the question of wants versus needs. Look, as Anne very correctly points out, human needs are limited, but I actually think that human material wants are also limited. This is not so much a conflict between wants and needs. It's a conflict between limited human needs and the demands of limitless capital accumulation, right? And that's what we have to target. As far as desire goes, there's a strong component of degrowth theory that points out that desire, unlike growth, can be immaterial, right? So we should have lots of amazing sex in a degrowth scenario or something along these lines, right? Like, so we can, there are other ways for us to effloresce, you know, human desire. That are not exhausted by the capitalist economy, I guess is my point here.
Thank you, Jason. I want to go over to Sam actually for a sort of a trade union kind of perspective on this, because I think there's something that touches on here and something that seems to be happening more often where collective bargaining, where you have it in Britain, but where it tends to be stronger in Europe, is demands not so much for monetary rewards from work, but increasing demands for greater flexibility of working time and yeah, expanding the scope of what a bargain might look like for labour that isn't just we do more work, you give us more money. I wonder if Sam might want to pick up on some of that and respond there.
Yeah, there is a lot of that. I mean, there's different forms of trade unionism, and I think we have to recognise that, and you know, in the UK, but across Europe as well. And I think, you know, we in the UK tended to have a very market-orientated trade unionism that tends to highlight things around pay, and not to say that we haven't done collective bargaining around other terms, conditions. And, you know, interestingly, one of the things in PCS before COVID hit, some of our reps were looking at was trying to negotiate extended leave so they wouldn't have to get a flight if they were having a holiday in Europe. so they get the train and add on a day extra side, for example. So, you know, those discussions are happening. I'd say probably, you know, there is more, you know, some other union movements obviously bargain more on social issues as well, which I think we tend to do less of in the UK, not exclusively haven't, but tend to do less of. But I think some of that also comes back to some of the militancy and political role within trade unions, which we've lost a bit over time, although, you know, we've seen some of it coming back recently, obviously with the Russia, you know, Ukraine situation of, you know, refusing to offload the Russian tankers. But interestingly, so, you know, I've been in debates about what trade unions be doing in terms of fossil fuels. You know, let's take this a step further, and how do we start to move that and change that debate as well. So I think that there's an interesting discussion about what we collectively bargain from, and of course it's very narrow in the UK as well, so restricted by our labour laws of what we can bargain over and what we can't. But I think they have to be part of those conversations as part of the transition as well. So, yeah.
Thank you, Sam. And finally, just sort of on this question of I suppose, alternative consumption and how we might start to win the arguments around it, how we start to, well, even if we need to, I mean, I detect with Anne a certain, I don't know about skepticism, but a certain belief that we don't necessarily have to say to people that this is going to be changes to your lifestyle in quite the way that perhaps sometimes degrowth implies. I wonder if Anne wants to pick up on this question of consumption and how we might change consumption over time, better fitted in with planetary boundaries.
Yeah. People today, you know, are unhappy and feel that they can satisfy their feelings of unease and of dissatisfaction and of lack of fulfillment by buying another party dress from it, you know, that they've spotted, so they can, I don't know, on a website, and then wearing it for a day and sending it back again. You know, this is about, you know, our deepest needs are not being met by these things. And of course, it's going to be hard to persuade people that things don't satisfy their needs. But I think we found that in the pandemic. I was really struck in the pandemic. I live in quite rural part of Britain, quite very conservative part of Britain, and we couldn't go shopping, and people came together and started to work to support their community and to support the most vulnerable in their community. And the community spirit and the cooperativeness of it all was just amazing. And people, I think, are still kind of, immediately they're back in the shops, of course, but they still have that in their memory of actually what they felt really good about was being part of a broader effort and in solidarity with others. And this gave them a real sense of meaning. So I'm waffling now, but actually I think people's needs are spiritual, they're physical. We want love, we want recognition, we want pleasure, we want sex, all of these things. But doesn't necessarily mean that those things are not satisfied by having more things. But I'm now, you know, moving into the realm that I'm not really much expert at. But I personally am of the view that we will feel much more fulfilled in a simpler lifestyle, which actually addresses our needs. It's because our needs are not being met that we're looking elsewhere for compensation.
And thank you for that. And then perhaps before we well and truly drift off out of economics, that might be a good point at which to end the discussion for this evening. Thank you very much to the panel for coming. I thought it was a really fascinating debate and discussion amongst you all. Thank you very much to the audience for coming along as well. I'm hoping, Jason, you might be able to make your slides available on the PEF website. Would that be something? We've had a request come in, if that's okay. So we can put them up there, and we'll put a recording up as usual of the whole webinar as well. Next one will be in a month or so's time. Do look out for the PEF email list if you're on it, and please sign up if you're not. And thanks again, everyone. Thank you.
Cheers.